The desert wind carried the scent of death across the red rocks of Arizona territory. Standing over the still form of his companion, the man known only as Shadow felt something break inside his chest. The wolf lay sprawled in the dust, 3 bullet holes marking where the bounty hunters had found their target. Blood had already dried black in the scorching sun, and flies buzzed around the wounds that would never heal. Shadow's weathered hands trembled as he knelt beside the animal that had been more than a pet, more than a friend. This wolf had been his brother, his family, the only living thing that had shown him loyalty in a world that had taken everything else. The Apache half of his blood sang with rage, while the white half calculated revenge. Both sides agreed on one thing: someone would pay for this. The wolf's name had been Storm, given for the way he could appear and disappear like lightning across the landscape. Shadow had found him as a pup, abandoned and starving near a burned-out Apache village. That was 15 years ago, when Shadow himself was running from his past, trying to forget the massacre that had claimed his mother's people and driven him into the wilderness. Now Storm lay dead, and the careful peace Shadow had built in his heart crumbled like ancient pottery. He closed the wolf's eyes with gentle fingers, then stood and walked to where his horse waited. The black stallion, sensing his master's mood, stepped nervously as Shadow pulled his gun belt from the saddlebags. The leather was worn smooth from years of use, and the twin Colt .45s nested in their holsters like sleeping serpents. Shadow had not worn these guns for 3 months, not since he and Storm had settled in the small valley where they'd hoped to live quietly. He'd even started talking to the widow Patterson about maybe building a cabin, maybe putting down roots for the first time since childhood. All of that was finished now. Shadow strapped on the gun belt and felt the familiar weight settle around his hips. The metal was warm from the desert heat, and when he drew both pistols to check the loads, they came up smooth as water. 6 shots in each cylinder, 12 chances to balance the scales. It would be enough. The tracks were easy to follow. 3 horses heading northeast toward the town of Copper Creek, their riders confident enough to make no effort at concealment. Why should they hide? They'd killed a wolf, nothing more. Animals died every day in the territory. They probably thought they were doing the ranchers a favor. Shadow mounted his horse and began to follow, but his mind was already racing ahead to what he knew about the men he was hunting. The tracks told him things that would have been invisible to most people, but his Apache grandfather had taught him to read the earth like white men read books. The first horse carried a heavy man who favored his left side, probably nursing an old wound. The second rider was lighter, but careless, letting his mount wander instead of keeping to the trail. The third horse showed signs of lameness in the right front hoof, which would slow them down. 3 men, probably bounty hunters or drifters looking for easy money. Storm had been with Shadow when they'd ridden into Copper Creek 2 days ago for supplies. The wolf had waited outside the general store while Shadow bought coffee and ammunition, drawing curious stares from the townspeople. Children had pointed and whispered, some in fear, others in wonder at seeing such a magnificent animal. It was there that Shadow had overheard the conversation that now made his blood run cold with understanding. 3 men had been drinking on the porch of the Silver Dollar Saloon, loud enough for half the street to hear their bragging. Bet that wolf would bring good money from the right buyer, one had said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Rich folks back east pay top dollar for exotic pets. Don't look much like a pet to me, another had replied. Looks more like a killer. Probably rabid. Either way, easy money. Just got to get away from that breed. The word breed had hit Shadow like a physical blow. It was what they called men like him, caught between 2 worlds and welcome in neither. His father had been a cavalry officer who'd fallen in love with an Apache woman during a peace negotiation. When the army found out, they drummed him out of service. When the Apache found out, they'd cast her out of the tribe. Shadow had grown up hearing that word whispered behind his back in every town they tried to settle in. Sometimes it was said with pity, sometimes with disgust, but always with the understanding that he was something less than human, something that didn't quite belong anywhere. Now, those same men had taken Storm, thinking the wolf would be easy prey without his human protector. They'd been wrong about that, but not wrong enough to stay alive. Storm had fought them, the tracks showed that much. Gouges in the earth where his claws had found purchase, scattered brass cartridge cases where they'd had to empty their weapons to bring him down. The trail led through a canyon where red rocks rose like the walls of a cathedral, then out onto the flatlands where the desert stretched endlessly under a burning sky. Shadow's horse moved at a steady lope, eating up the miles while the sun crawled across the heavens like a dying thing. By the time the sun touched the horizon, painting the desert the color of fresh blood, Shadow could smell wood smoke on the wind. He dismounted and climbed a low hill to scout ahead, moving with the silent grace his grandfather had taught him. What he saw made his jaw clench with cold fury. The three men had made camp in a small depression surrounded by scrub brush, confident that they were safe from pursuit. They'd built their fire large and bright, and the smell of cooking bacon drifted on the evening air. One man sat cleaning his rifle while another tended the horses. The third was skinning something near the fire. It was Storm. Shadow's vision went red around the edges as he watched the man work his knife around the wolf's pelt, cutting away the beautiful silver-gray fur that had been Storm's pride. They weren't just killers. They were trophy hunters, planning to sell Storm's hide to the highest bidder. The rage that filled Shadow's chest was like drinking liquid fire. His hands moved to his guns without conscious thought, and for a moment he almost charged down the hill with both pistols blazing. Only the memory of his grandfather's voice held him back. A warrior strikes when his enemy cannot strike back, the old man had whispered during Shadow's training. Anger makes a man stupid. Patience makes him deadly. So Shadow waited and watched as the men finished their grisly work. He memorized their faces in the firelight, noting the way they moved and the weapons they carried. The heavy man from the tracks wore a beard and favored his left arm, keeping it close to his body. An old wound, as Shadow had guessed. The careless rider was younger, maybe 20, with the nervous energy of someone trying to prove himself. The third man was older, careful, and methodical in his movements. The leader. They talked as they worked, their voices carrying clearly in the still desert air. Pelt like this'll bring $50 easy, the older man was saying. Maybe more if we can get it to Santa Fe. What about the breed? Asked the young one. Think he'll come after us? The bearded man laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. Him? He's probably halfway to Mexico by now. These half-bloods got no spine when it comes to real trouble. Still, the young one persisted, maybe we should post a watch tonight. Kid's right, said the leader. Jake, you take first watch. Billy, you spell him at midnight. I'll take the morning shift. Shadow smiled coldly in the darkness. They were scared enough to post guards, but not smart enough to realize they were already dead men. He slipped back down the hill to where his horse waited, then made his own camp a quarter-mile away, cold and dark. That night, Shadow sat with his back against a boulder and cleaned his weapons by starlight. The ritual was as familiar as breathing. Remove the cylinders, wipe down each chamber, check the springs and firing pins, reload with fresh cartridges. His grandfather had taught him that a man's weapons were extensions of his spirit, and a dirty gun was like a sick soul. As he worked, Shadow let his mind drift back to the day he'd found Storm. The Apache village had been burning when he'd arrived, the cavalry having struck at dawn while the warriors were away hunting. His mother lay dead in the doorway of her wickiup, 3 bullet holes in her chest that matched the ones he'd found in Storm today. He'd been hunting the soldiers responsible when he'd heard the whimpering from the brush. The wolf pup had been no bigger than a cat, his eyes barely open, crying for a mother who would never return. Something in that sound had reached through Shadow's rage and touched the part of him that was still human. He'd almost left the pup to die. Death would have been kinder than the life of an orphan in a world that had no place for wild things. But when the tiny creature had crawled toward him and fallen asleep against his boot, Shadow had felt something he'd thought was dead forever. Hope. From that day forward, Storm had been his constant companion. The wolf had learned to hunt and fight at Shadow's side, had shared his food and water, had stood guard while he slept. They drifted through the territories like smoke, taking work where they could find it, avoiding the army and the Apache both. Storm had never shown fear of man or beast. He'd faced down grizzly bears and mountain lions, had charged into gunfights alongside Shadow without hesitation. The wolf had been braver than most men, more loyal than any friend, more family than Shadow had ever known. And now Storm was dead, killed by men who saw only the value of his pelt. Shadow finished cleaning his guns and holstered them, then lay back to watch the stars wheel overhead. Tomorrow would bring blood and death, but tonight belonged to memory. He closed his eyes and remembered Storm as a pup, trying to howl and managing only a squeaky whine. He remembered teaching the young wolf to hunt rabbits, to track deer, to read the wind for the scent of enemies. Most of all, He remembered the trust in those yellow eyes, the absolute faith that Shadow would protect him from all the dangers of the world. That trust had been broken today, and the men responsible would pay for it with their lives. When dawn broke gray and cold over the desert, Shadow was already moving. He'd circled around the killer's camp in the pre-dawn darkness, positioning himself on a ridge that overlooked their position. The morning watch had dozed off, his rifle across his knees, chin on his chest. The other two men were still asleep by the cold ashes of their fire, wrapped in blankets that would become their shrouds. Storm's pelt was stretched on a wooden frame, drying in the cool morning air. The sight of it made Shadow's trigger finger itch, but he forced himself to wait. Patience. The sleeping guard jerked awake as the sun cleared the horizon, looked around guiltily to make sure no one had seen him napping, then stood and stretched. He walked to the edge of camp to relieve himself, his back to Shadow's position on the ridge. It was time. Shadow drew both pistols and stepped into the open, his boots silent on the rocky ground. The morning light caught the metal of his guns and threw bright reflections across the camp below. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly in the still air. "You kill my wolf." The guard spun around, fumbling for his rifle, and Shadow's first shot took him in the chest. The man dropped his weapon and sat down hard, a look of surprise on his face as blood began to seep through his shirt. The other two men came awake instantly, reaching for their guns even as Shadow's second shot shattered the bearded man's left shoulder. The leader rolled behind a saddle and came up with a pistol, but Shadow was already moving, sliding down the rocky slope like liquid shadow. Bullets whined off the rocks around him as he descended, but Shadow didn't hurry. He had all the time in the world. These men had stolen time from Storm, and now time belonged to Shadow. He would spend it carefully, making sure each shot counted. The bearded man was trying to reload, one-handed, blood streaming down his arm. Shadow's third shot took him in the right knee, spinning him around and dumping him face first in the dirt. The man screamed and kept screaming, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like a wounded animal. That left the leader, who was smart enough to stay behind cover and disciplined enough to make his shots count. A bullet creased Shadow's left arm as he dove behind a boulder, then another shattered rock near his head. The man was a good shot, but not good enough. Shadow had fought Apaches and cavalry, outlaws and lawmen, bears and mountain lions. He'd learned to kill when he was 12 years old and had been practicing ever since. These men were good, but they weren't good enough to matter. Moving like smoke between the rocks, Shadow circled around until he had a clear shot at the leader's position. The man was reloading when Shadow's fourth bullet found him, punching through his gun arm and spinning him away from his weapon. Now all three men were wounded but alive, exactly as Shadow had planned. He stepped into the camp with his guns still drawn, looking down at them with eyes like chips of winter ice. The guard who'd been on watch was dead, but the other two were very much alive and in considerable pain. "Please," gasped the leader, clutching his shattered arm. "We can pay you. Whatever you want." Shadow didn't answer. He walked to where Storm's pelt was stretched on the frame and touched it gently, feeling the soft fur that would never again warm a living body. The wolf's beautiful markings were all there, the silver guard hairs, the black ear tips, the white blaze on his chest that had looked like a lightning bolt. "We didn't know," the bearded man whimpered. "Didn't know it was your pet." "He wasn't my pet," Shadow said quietly, still looking at the pelt. "He was my brother." He turned back to face the wounded men, and they saw death in his eyes. Not the hot death of anger, but the cold death of justice. Patient and implacable as winter. "You're going to die now," Shadow told him simply. "But first, you're going to suffer." Storm suffered when you shot him. He died afraid and alone, wondering why I wasn't there to protect him. The bearded man tried to crawl away, dragging his broken leg behind him. Shadow let him go a few yards before putting a bullet through his other knee. The man collapsed and lay still, either unconscious or dead. The leader was made of sterner stuff. He sat up straighter despite the pain in his arm and met Shadow's gaze directly. "You think killing us will bring your wolf back?" "No, Sadori Blade. But it will balance the scales." He raised both pistols, and in a moment before he fired, the man's eyes went wide with the realization that he was about to die. The shots echoed across the desert like thunder, and then there was silence. Shadow stood alone in the camp with the morning sun warm on his face and the smell of gunpowder sharp in his nostrils. Storm was still dead, and revenge hadn't brought him back, but the debt had been paid in full. Now came the hard part. Now Shadow had to figure out how to live in a world without his brother. The town of Copper Creek looked different when Shadow rode back through its dusty streets 3 days later. The same buildings lined the main road, the same people went about their business, but something fundamental had changed. Maybe it was Shadow himself who was different, hollowed out by grief and hardened by the revenge he'd taken in the desert. Storm's pelt was rolled carefully in his saddlebags, cleaned, and treated with the reverence due to a fallen warrior. Shadow had spent 2 days preparing it properly, using methods his Apache grandmother had taught him for preserving the hides of sacred animals. Every hair was in place, every marking preserved. When the time came, Storm would be buried with the honor he deserved. But first, Shadow had business in town. The Silver Dollar Saloon was busy even though it was barely past noon. Cowboys and drifters crowded around tables thick with cigar smoke, their voices loud with whiskey and false bravado. Shadow pushed through the batwing doors and moved to the bar, his spurs ringing softly on the wooden floor. The bartender was a fat man with nervous eyes who'd seen enough trouble to recognize it when it walked through his door. He looked at Shadow's guns at the cold set of his features and swallowed hard before speaking. "What can I get you?" "Information," Shadow said quietly. "3 men were drinking here a few days ago, talking about my wolf." The bartender's face went pale. News traveled fast in small towns, and word of 3 bodies found in the desert had already reached Copper Creek. The sheriff had ridden out that morning to investigate, but everyone knew what he'd find. "I don't know nothing about that," the bartender stammered. Shadow placed a gold coin on the bar, more money than the man made in a week. "I'm not looking for trouble. I just want to know who they were." The coin disappeared into the bartender's apron faster than a snake strike. He leaned closer and lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. The older one called himself Harper, said he was from Kansas, but his accent sounded more like Texas to me. The big bearded fellow went by Jake something or other. The young one never gave a name, just tagged along like a lost puppy. "Anyone else with them?" The bartender shook his head. "Just the 3. They were asking about work, bounty hunting maybe. Sheriff Hawkins told them to move along, said he didn't want their kind of trouble in his town." Shadow nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. "These men, they say anything about other jobs? Other wolves?" "Now that you mention it, yeah." The young one was bragging about some big ranch owner up near Flagstaff who was paying good money for wolf pelts. Said there was a whole pack causing problems, killing cattle. The words hit Shadow like a physical blow. A whole pack. Storm hadn't been alone when the killers found him. There had been others, wild wolves that Storm had been running with, living the life he'd been born for, but never known. This ranch owner have a name? Morrison, I think. William Morrison. Owns the Flying M spread, biggest outfit in the territory. Word is he's offering $50 a pelt, no questions asked. Shadow felt something cold settle in his stomach. $50 was more money than most men saw in a year. With that kind of bounty, every gun in the territory would be hunting wolves. Storm's pack, the family he'd finally found, would be slaughtered for profit, unless someone stopped them. Shadow left the saloon and walked to the general store, where he bought supplies for a long journey. Ammunition, jerky, coffee, grain for his horse. The store owner, a friendly man named Peterson, tried to make conversation. Heard there was some trouble out in the desert. Sheriff's gone to have a look. Trouble finds men who look for it, Shadow replied, loading cartridges into his gun belt. True enough. You heading out again soon? North, toward Flagstaff. Peterson nodded knowingly. A lot of men heading that way lately. Word is there's good money to be made in wolf pelts. So I heard. Of course, wolves are dangerous animals. Kill a man as easy as look at him. Probably doing everyone a favor, clearing them out. Shadow's hand stilled on his gun, but, you ever see a wolf kill a man? Well, no, but everyone knows Dash, I have, Shadow interrupted. Seen wolves and men both. Know which one I trust more. He finished loading his supplies and walked out, leaving Peterson staring after him with confusion written across his face. Outside, Shadow mounted his horse and rode north, following the road that would take him to Flagstaff and whatever waited beyond. The journey took 3 days through country that grew more beautiful with each mile. Red rocks gave way to pine forests, and the desert heat was replaced by cool mountain air that smelled of snow and growing things. Shadow camped each night beside clear streams that reminded him of times when Storm would drink deeply, then look up with water dripping from his muzzle. On the third day, he crested a ridge and saw the flying M spread laid out in the valley below. It was everything the bartender had promised: vast, prosperous, and powerful. Thousands of acres of grassland stretched to the horizon, dotted with cattle and crossed by well-maintained roads. The ranch house was a sprawling affair of stone and timber that looked more like a fortress than a home. Shadow made his camp in the trees and spent the rest of the day watching the ranch through field glasses he'd taken from one of the dead bounty hunters. What he saw made his jaw clench with anger. A dozen men were coming and going from the main house, all of them armed and carrying the look of professional killers. Not cowboys or ranch hands, but hired guns brought in for one purpose. In a yard behind the house, wooden frames were stretched with wolf pelts, at least 20 of them, silver and gray and black, drying in the mountain sun. Storm's family was already dead. That night, Shadow sat by his cold camp and planned his approach. The ranch was too big and too well defended for a direct assault, even for a man with his skills. But Morrison had made one mistake. He turned wolf hunting into a business, which meant he needed to advertise his success. The next morning, Shadow rode boldly down the ranch road and up to the main house. A guard with a shotgun stopped him at the gate, looking suspiciously at Shadow's guns and Apache features. "State your business." "Looking for work," Shadow said simply. "Heard Mr. Morrison pays good money for wolf pelts." The guard's suspicion faded slightly. Wolf hunters came in all shapes and colors, and money was colorblind. "You any good with those guns?" Shadow smiled coldly. "Good enough. Wait here." The guard disappeared into the house and returned a few minutes later with a tall, well-dressed man who could only be William Morrison. The ranch owner was younger than Shadow had expected, maybe 40, with the soft hands of someone who'd never done hard work. But his eyes were sharp and calculating, and they missed nothing as they studied Shadow from head to toe. "You're the one wants work hunting wolves, if the pay is what I hear." Morrison nodded slowly. $50 a pelt, prime condition only. Bring me proof they're dead, and the money's yours." "What kind of proof?" "The pelts, obviously, but I also want the heads. Wolves are smart animals, and some of these hunters have been trying to pass off dog pelts as the real thing." Shadow kept his face blank despite the rage building in his chest. "How many wolves are we talking about?" "There's a pack donate up in the high country, maybe 15 or 20 animals. They've been hitting my cattle hard, and I want them all dead. Every last one. Big job for one man." Morrison's smile was cold as winter wind. "You won't be working alone. I got a dozen of the best hunters money can buy already on the trail. You'll be working with them, sharing information and coordinates." "What if I work alone?" "Then you get $50 a pelt, same as everyone else. But the pack wolves are smart, and they've learned to avoid the hunting parties. A lone hunter might have better luck." Shadow nodded slowly, as if considering the offer. In truth, he was already planning how to kill every one of Morrison's hunters before they could reach the pack. "I'll need supplies. The cookhouse will feed you, and there's ammunition in the bunkhouse. Anything else you need, put on my account at the store in town." "When do I start?" "Soon as you're ready. The other hunters are already in the field, but they haven't had much luck yet. Wolves keep moving, staying ahead of them." That evening, Shadow sat in the bunkhouse with Morrison's killers and listened to their plans. They were a hard bunch, men who'd made careers out of violence and saw wolf hunting as easy money. Most of them were drunk, bragging about past kills, and making crude jokes about Apache half-breeds. Shadow let them talk, filing away useful information while he cleaned his weapons. The wolves had denayed in a box canyon about 20 miles north, but they'd been moving at night to avoid the hunting parties. Several men had gotten close enough to wound animals, but none had managed a clean kill. "Problem is they've got sentries posted," explained a scar man named Coleman, who seemed to be the leader of the group. "Smart as Indians, these wolves. Soon as they smell you coming, they're gone." "Maybe what you need is someone who thinks like an Indian," Shadow suggested quietly. Coleman laughed, not realizing how close he was to death. "That's why Morrison hired you, Breed. Figure you might be able to track them better than white men." "Maybe. Well, you're welcome to try. But I wouldn't get your hopes up. These ain't ordinary wolves. There's something different about this pack, something that makes them harder to kill." Shadow knew what that something was. Storm had been with them, teaching them the lessons he'd learned in 15 years of running from men with guns. How to read the wind for the scent of enemies, how to move without leaving tracks, how to think like humans and stay one step ahead. The pack was surviving because Storm had taught them how to survive. That night, Shadow slipped out of the bunkhouse and retrieved Storm's pelt from his saddlebags. He unrolled it carefully in the moonlight and placed his hands flat against the soft fur, feeling the spirit of his brother still trapped within. "I found them," he whispered. "Found your family. They're alive because of what you taught them." The wind through the pines sounded almost like a wolf's howl, and Shadow felt a presence beside him in the darkness. Not visible, but there nonetheless. Storm had not gone to whatever place waited beyond death. He was still here, waiting for his family to be safe. "I'll protect them," Shadow promised. "All of them. And then I'll send these killers to join the men who murdered you." The presence faded with the dawn, but Shadow felt strengthened by it. He wasn't fighting alone. Storm was with him still, and together they would save the pack that had welcomed a lonely wolf in his final days. Shadow spent the next day preparing for what was to come. He studied maps of the high country, memorizing every trail and canyon. He visited the general store and bought special ammunition, bullets made of silver that his Apache grandmother had sworn were the only things that could kill evil spirits. The bullets were for Morrison's men, not wolves. But Shadow thought his grandmother would approve. That evening, Coleman announced that the hunting party would move out at dawn, following fresh tracks that had been spotted near Willow Creek. Shadow volunteered to scout ahead, claiming his Apache training would let him move more quietly than the others. Coleman agreed, not knowing he was sending Shadow to warn the very animals they were hunting. Shadow rode out before dawn, following the trail north into country that grew wilder with each mile. The tracks were easy to follow, too easy, as if the wolves wanted to be found. But Shadow understood their strategy. They were leading the hunters away from the den site, sacrificing themselves to protect the young. He found the pack just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, spread out along a ridge line that commanded a perfect view of the approaches. 15 wolves, maybe more, their gray forms barely visible against the rocks. They'd chosen their ground well, with escape routes in 3 directions and plenty of cover. Shadow dismounted and approached on foot, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. The wolves watched him come, tense but not panicked. They'd learned to be wary of men, but something about Shadow's scent must have been familiar. The pack leader was a magnificent animal, silver-gray with intelligent yellow eyes that reminded Shadow painfully of Storm. When the big wolf stepped forward to confront the intruder, Shadow caught his scent and knew the truth. This was Storm's son, carrying his father's blood and his father's wisdom. The resemblance was unmistakable, from the white blaze on his chest to the proud set of his head. Storm had found a mate before his death, and this young alpha was living proof of that bond. Shadow knelt in the dirt and spoke quietly in the Apache language his grandfather had taught him. "I'm Storm's brother," he said. "I have come to warn you." The young alpha tilted his head, listening not just to the words, but to something deeper. The scent of grief and loss that clung to Shadow like smoke, the echo of violence that followed him wherever he went. But underneath all that was something else, the smell of pack, of belonging, of loyalty that transcended species. After a long moment, the alpha sat down, which was as close to trust as a wild wolf could offer. The rest of the pack remained alert, but no longer ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Shadow spent the rest of the morning with the wolves, sharing jerky from his pack and water from his canteen. He told them in simple words what was coming. Men with guns who would kill without mercy or honor, who saw only the value of their pelts. The wolves listened with the patience of their kind, yellow eyes fixed on his face as if they could understand every word. Maybe they could. Storm had been teaching them about humans for months, and not all the lessons had been about avoiding danger. When the sun reached its peak, Shadow heard the distant sound of horses and knew Coleman's party was approaching. The wolves heard it too, ears pricking forward and noses testing the wind. Time to go. But the young alpha had other ideas. Instead of leading his pack to safety, he moved to Shadow's side and sat down again, pressing his warm flank against the man's leg. The message was clear. "We stand with Storm's brother." Shadow felt tears sting his eyes for the first time since Storm's death. These wolves were willing to fight beside him, to die beside him if necessary. They understood loyalty in a way that most humans never would. "No," he told them firmly. "This is my fight. Take your pack and go north into the deep woods where men can't follow. The alpha whined softly, reluctant to abandon a member of his extended family. But Shadow's tone brooked no argument, and after a moment the big wolf stood and called his pack with a low howl. They flowed away like smoke, disappearing into the rocks and trees with barely a sound. In seconds, Shadow was alone on the ridge with only the wind for company. But not for long. Coleman's voice echoed off the canyon walls as the hunting party approached. "Fresh tracks here. They can't be far." Shadow drew both pistols and moved into position among the rocks, choosing his ground carefully. Below him, a dozen killers were riding to their deaths, confident in their numbers and their weapons. They had no idea they were being hunted by something far more dangerous than any wolf. The first shot rang out across the mountains like thunder, and William Morrison's war against the wolves entered a new and deadlier phase. The gunfight in the mountains lasted less than 10 minutes, but for Shadow it felt like hours. Time moved differently when death was dancing all around you, when every heartbeat could be your last, and every breath might be the one that saved your life. Coleman's men were good. Shadow had to give them that. They spread out quickly when the shooting started, taking cover behind rocks and trees, returning disciplined fire that chipped stone inches from his head. These weren't drunken cowboys or nervous bounty hunters. These were professional killers who'd learned their trade in wars and range conflicts. But Shadow was something else entirely. Moving like smoke between the boulders, he picked his shots carefully, making every bullet count. The silver cartridges his grandmother had blessed seemed to find their targets with supernatural accuracy, dropping men who thought they were safely hidden. When the smoke cleared and the echoes faded, 11 bodies lay scattered across the mountainside like broken dolls. Only Coleman was still alive, and barely that. Shadow found him propped against a pine tree, blood seeping from a hole in his chest that made a wet sucking sound when he breathed. The man's eyes were already growing glassy, but he managed a bitter laugh when Shadow approached. "Guess Morrison was right about you Indians," he wheezed. "You do fight different." Shadow knelt beside the dying man, his smoking pistol still in his hands. "You came to kill innocents. This is what happens. Innocents." Coleman coughed up blood, spraying it across his shirt front. "They're animals. Predators. So are you. Difference is, wolves only kill when they're hungry." Coleman tried to say something else, but the words turned into a death rattle that echoed off the canyon walls. Shadow closed the man's eyes with surprising gentleness, then began the grim task of gathering weapons and ammunition from the dead. 11 men with modern rifles and enough cartridges to fight a small war. Morrison would be expecting them back in a few days, and when they didn't return, he'd send more killers to find out what happened. Shadow needed to be ready for them. He spent the rest of the day preparing his defenses, dragging bodies into a pile, and setting them ablaze with coal oil from their own supplies. The smoke would be visible for miles, sending a clear message to anyone who cared to read it. The wolf hunters had become the hunted. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky the color of fresh blood, Shadow heard a familiar howl drifting down from the high country. The pack was calling to him, offering comfort in the ancient language of the wilderness. He tilted back his head and answered, his voice joining theirs in a song of loss and defiance that echoed through the mountains like thunder. That night, Shadow made his camp in a hidden valley where a natural spring provided fresh water and thick pine groves offered concealment. He'd found the place years ago while running from a cavalry patrol, and it had saved his life more than once. Tonight, it would serve as his fortress. He was cleaning his weapons by firelight when he heard the soft whisper of paws on pine needles. The young alpha appeared at the edge of the firelight, moving with the ghost-like silence of his kind. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, Shadow could see the rest of the pack. "I told you to go north," Shadow said quietly, not looking up from his work. The alpha padded closer and lay down beside the fire, his yellow eyes reflecting the flames like molten gold. The wolf was young, maybe 3 years old, but he carried himself with the dignity of a king. Storm's blood showed in every line of his powerful frame. "Your father was stubborn too," Shadow continued, running an oiled cloth down the barrel of his Colt. "Never would listen when I told him to stay safe." The alpha made a soft whining sound that might have been sympathy or agreement. Other wolves began to emerge from the darkness, settling around the fire like a gathering of spirits. Shadow counted 15 adults and at least 6 pups, all watching him with the patient attention of their kind. They were a family, he realized. Not just a pack, but a true family bound together by blood and loyalty and shared hardship. Storm had found what Shadow had been searching for his entire life. A place to belong, people who understood what it meant to be different, to be caught between worlds. And now these killers wanted to destroy them for money. Shadow finished cleaning his weapons and fed fresh wood to the fire, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. The wolves settled in for the night, some standing watch while others curled up in the warmth of the flames. For a few hours, the war could wait. But dawn brought new dangers. Shadow woke to the alpha's low growl and immediately knew something was wrong. The big wolf was standing at the edge of camp, hackles raised, nose testing the wind for threats. The rest of the pack was awake too, tense and ready to fight or flee. Horses, at least 20 of them, moving up the mountain trail with the steady persistence of a military patrol. Morrison had sent reinforcements, probably every gun hand he could hire from the surrounding towns. They'd found the burning bodies, and now they were tracking Shadow to his lair. Shadow quickly broke camp and scattered the ashes of his fire, erasing as much sign as possible. The wolves melted away into the forest without a sound, but the alpha lingered at his side. "Go," Shadow told him firmly. "Protect your family. This isn't your fight." The alpha looked at him with Storm's eyes, and Shadow felt his resolve waver. These wolves had accepted him as one of their own, offered him the belonging he'd craved his entire life. To send him away felt like tearing out his own heart. But Storm's family would not die because of Shadow's war. "Go," he repeated, and this time the alpha obeyed, disappearing into the trees like a silver ghost. Shadow moved to a defensive position among the rocks overlooking the trail, where he could see the approaching riders while remaining hidden himself. What he saw made his blood run cold with fury. Morrison was leading the column personally, mounted on a magnificent black stallion, and dressed like he was heading to a church social. Behind him rode at least 30 men, all armed to the teeth, and looking like they meant business. But it wasn't the numbers that made Shadow's trigger finger itch. It was the cage wagon rolling along at the rear of the column. The wooden cage was 8 feet square and 4 feet high, barely large enough for a man to sit upright. Inside, Shadow could see a small form huddled against the bars, a wolf pup, maybe 4 months old, whimpering in terror as the wagon bounced over the rough trail. Bait. Morrison was using the pup to draw out the pack, knowing that wolves would risk anything to protect their young. It was a strategy that showed both intelligence and complete ruthlessness, the mark of a man who understood how to exploit his enemy's greatest strength. Love. Shadow felt rage build his chest like a forest fire, hot and consuming and almost impossible to control. They'd killed Storm, murdered Coleman's men when they came for the pack, and now they were torturing a helpless pup to lure its family into a trap. Enough. Shadow rose from his hiding place and stepped into the open, both hands resting on his gun butts. His voice carried clearly down the mountainside, cutting through the morning air like a knife. "Morrison." The column stopped as if they'd hit a wall. Men reached for weapons while horses danced nervously, sensing the tension that crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. Morrison himself remained calm, studying Shadow with the cold calculation of a predator. "You must be the Apache I hired," Morrison called back. "Heard you ran into some trouble with my hunting party. They came hunting wolves. Found something else instead." Morrison's smile was winter cold. "Yes, I can see that. 11 good men, burned like garbage. That's going to cost you. The only thing it's going to cost is your life." Brave words for a man standing alone against 30 guns. Shadow's smile was colder than Morrison's, touched with the promise of violence and pain. "Who says I'm alone?" As if summoned by his words, howls erupted from the forest around them. Not the mournful song Shadow had heard the night before, but the battle cry of wolves protecting their territory. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the rocks and trees until it was impossible to tell how many voices were singing. Morrison's men looked around nervously, fingers tightening on triggers as they tried to locate the source of the howling. Their horses began to spook, rolling their eyes and sidling away from threats they couldn't see. "Wolves don't attack humans," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "These aren't ordinary wolves," Shadow replied. "They're Apache wolves, and they remember what you did to their brother." The howling stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that Shadow could hear his own heartbeat. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Morrison raised his hand, and 30 rifles swung toward Shadow's position. Kill him. The gunfire erupted like thunder, muzzle flashes winking in the morning light as bullets whined off the rocks around Shadow's position. But he was no longer there, having dropped into a hidden crevice just as Morrison gave the order. The real battle began when the wolves attacked. They came from 3 directions at once, flowing down the mountainside like a gray tide. Storm's son led the charge, his lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed ivory fangs, his yellow eyes blazing with righteous fury. Behind him came the rest of the pack, 15 adult wolves driven to madness by the sight of their captured pup. Morrison's men were good shots, but they'd never faced anything like this. Wolves moved differently than men, flowing around obstacles and changing direction without warning. They were smart enough to use cover and fast enough to make every shot count. The horses went crazy with fear, bucking and rearing and throwing their riders into the path of snapping jaws. Men who'd been calm and disciplined seconds before now fired wildly into the trees, their shots going wide as panic took hold. Shadow rose from his hiding place and added his guns to the chaos, picking his targets carefully. The silver bullets found their marks with deadly precision, dropping men who thought they were safe behind cover. Within minutes, half of Morrison's force was down, dead or dying in the mountain dirt. Morrison himself had taken shelter behind the cage wagon, using the trapped pup as a human shield while he fired at anything that moved. His shots were disciplined and accurate, and Shadow saw 2 wolves go down under his guns. That was enough. Shadow broke cover and charged down the slope, both pistols blazing as he weaved between the rocks. Bullets whined past his ears and tugged at his clothes, but his Apache training kept him moving, kept him alive. He hit the wagon at a dead run and vaulted over the wooden sides, landing in a crouch with his guns trained on Morrison's chest. "It's over," Shadow said quietly. Morrison's rifle was empty, but he didn't seem inclined to surrender. Instead, he pulled a knife from his belt and held it to the wolf pup's throat. The little animal whimpered and tried to pull away from the cold steel. "You take one more step, and I cut its throat," Morrison snarled. Shadow looked at the pup, seeing Storm's markings in miniature. The silver fur, the white blaze on the chest, the intelligent eyes that held too much understanding for such a young animal. This was Storm's grandchild, the future of the bloodline that connected Shadow to the only family he'd ever known. "You're going to die either way," Shadow told Morrison. "Question is whether you die quick or slow. I've got friends in the territorial government," Morrison said desperately. "They'll pay good money for information about Apache hideouts. You kill me, and they'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. Let them come." Shadow's first shot took Morrison in the right shoulder, spinning him away from the pup and sending his knife spinning into the dirt. The second shot shattered his left knee, dropping him beside the cage where he lay screaming and clutching his wounds. Shadow holstered his guns and turned his attention to the cage, working the lock with hands that trembled slightly from the aftermath of battle. The pup cowered in the far corner, too frightened to understand that rescue had come. "Easy," Shadow murmured, extending his hand palm up toward the little wolf. "I'm family." The pup sniffed his fingers cautiously, then its tail began to wag. Storm's scent was all over Shadow, marking him as pack, as friend, as the man who'd loved their fallen leader. The pup crept forward and licked his hand with a tongue like wet velvet. Shadow lifted the little wolf from the cage and cradled it against his chest, feeling the rapid heartbeat gradually slow as fear gave way to trust. Around them, the surviving members of Morrison's army were fleeing down the mountain, abandoning their wounded leader to whatever fate awaited him. Morrison was still conscious, still trying to crawl away, when Storm's son appeared at the edge of the wagon. The big alpha looked at the man who'd tortured his pup, and his lips pulled back to reveal fangs like ivory daggers. "Please," Morrison whispered. "I've got money. Gold. I can pay you anything you want." Shadow looked down at him with eyes like winter ice. "You already paid. With blood." The alpha stepped forward, and Morrison's screams echoed across the mountains until they faded into blessed silence. When it was over, Shadow buried what was left and marked the grave with a cairn of stones. It seemed like the decent thing to do. The pack gathered around them as the sun reached its zenith, licking their wounds and mourning their dead. 2 wolves had fallen in the battle, brave animals who died protecting their family. Shadow helped dig their graves in the soft earth beside a mountain stream, and the entire pack howled their grief into the clear mountain air. But they'd won. Morrison was dead, his hired killers were scattered or buried, and the wolf hunts were over. For the first time in months, Storm's family was safe. That night, Shadow made camp beside the stream and shared his supplies with the pack. The rescued pup had attached itself to him like a shadow, following him everywhere and whimpering when he moved too far away. Storm's son seemed to approve, occasionally licking Shadow's hand or pressing against his side in a gesture of acceptance. They were family now, bound together by blood and loss and the promise Shadow had made to a dying wolf in the desert. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new enemies who wanted to destroy everything wild and free in the territory. But tonight, they had each other, and sometimes that was enough. 3 months had passed since the battle at Morrison's ranch, and the mountains had grown quiet again. Snow dusted the high peaks even though it was still autumn in the valleys below, and the aspens had turned golden in preparation for winter. Shadow had built a small cabin beside the stream where they'd buried the fallen wolves, using timber from the surrounding forest and stones from the mountainside. It wasn't much to look at, just 4 walls, a roof, and a stone fireplace, but it was home. The first real home Shadow had known since childhood, and the first place he'd ever lived where he didn't have to sleep with one hand on his gun. The wolf pack had denayed nearby for the winter, digging deep burrows in the hillside where they'd be protected from the worst of the mountain weather. Storm's son, who Shadow had started calling Thunder for his deep howl, had established himself as the alpha of not just the wolves but the entire extended family. He settled disputes with quiet authority, organized hunting parties with military precision, and somehow managed to keep track of 17 different personalities without ever losing his patience. The rescued pup, now nearly full-grown and answering to the name Lightning, had become Shadow's constant companion. Where Shadow went, Lightning followed. When Shadow worked on the cabin, Lightning carried tools in his mouth. When Shadow hunted for meat, Lightning flushed game toward his guns. At night, the young wolf slept beside Shadow's bed, one ear always alert for danger. It was a good life, better than Shadow had ever dared to hope for. But he should have known it wouldn't last. The first sign of trouble came with the arrival of Sheriff Hawkins from Copper Creek, riding up the mountain trail with 2 deputies and a piece of paper that would change everything. Shadow saw them coming from a mile away and met them at the tree line, his hands resting casually on his gun butts. "Sheriff," Shadow said politely. "Long way from town." Hawkins was a decent man, as lawmen went, but he looked uncomfortable as he dismounted from his horse. The paper in his hand shook slightly in the mountain wind, and his eyes kept darting to the wolves he could see watching from the shadows. "Shadow, I've got a warrant here for your arrest. Territory wants you for the murder of William Morrison and 36 of his men." Shadow felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Morrison was killed by wolves. I was just there when it happened. That's not how the story's being told in Santa Fe. Word is you murdered a respected rancher and his employees in cold blood, then disappeared into the mountains with a pack of killer wolves. And you believe that?" Hawkins met his gaze directly, and Shadow saw the truth there. The sheriff knew exactly what kind of man Morrison had been and what he'd been doing to the wolves. But knowing and proving were 2 different things, especially when territorial politics were involved. "Doesn't matter what I believe," Hawkins said quietly. "I've got my orders. You need to come with me. Face these charges in a proper court." Shadow glanced at the warrant, noting the territorial seal and the signature of Judge William Crawford. He'd heard of Crawford, a political appointee who'd made his fortune in mining and cattle, the kind of man who'd see the death of a few wolves as progress toward civilization. "And if I refuse, then I'll have to try to arrest you by force, and we both know how that would end." Behind Hawkins, the 2 deputies were young and nervous, their hands hovering near their weapons as they watched the wolves emerge from the forest. Thunder padded into view, followed by 8 other adults, their yellow eyes fixed on the intruders with predatory intensity. "Call them off, Shadow," one of the deputies said, his voice cracking with strain. "We don't want any trouble." "Neither do I," Shadow replied. "But trouble seems to follow certain kinds of men." He could feel lightning pressed against his leg. The young wolf's muscles coiled like springs. One word from Shadow, and These men would be torn apart before they could clear leather. But killing lawmen would only make things worse, would bring the entire territorial militia down on the pack's heads. "Give me 3 days," Shadow said finally. "3 days to get my affairs in order, then I'll come down to town peaceful-like." Hawkins nodded gratefully. 3 days. "But if you run, Shadow, if you disappear into the deep country, they'll send the army after you. And they won't stop with just you." The threat was clear. Run, and the pack would pay the price. Stay and face trial, and at least the wolves would be safe. For now. After the lawmen rode away, Shadow sat beside the stream and tried to think his way through the trap that was closing around him. Lightning curled up beside him, sensing his mood, while Thunder paced back and forth like a caged animal. The charges were serious. 37 counts of murder would mean a death sentence if he was convicted. And, with Judge Crawford presiding, conviction was almost certain. Morrison had been wealthy and connected, the kind of man the territory's power structure would want to see avenged. But there was more than justice at stake here. Someone was using Morrison's death to make a larger point about what happened to people who opposed the march of civilization. Shadow's trial would be a message to every Apache, every Mexican, every person who didn't fit neatly into the territory's vision of its future. Submit or die. That night, Shadow called the pack together and explained what was happening. The wolves listened with the patient attention of their kind, understanding more than most humans would have credited them with. When he finished speaking, Thunder approached and placed his great head against Shadow's chest in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "I have to go," Shadow told him. "If I run, they'll hunt all of us. But if I face this trial, you'll be safe. Free to find new territory, maybe up in Canada where there aren't so many ranchers." Lightning whined and pressed closer, unwilling to accept the idea of separation. The young wolf had never known a world without Shadow, had no concept of a life that didn't include his human brother. "Not all of us," Thunder seemed to say with his eyes. "The pack stays together." But Shadow shook his head firmly. "No, this is human business, human stupidity. You take the pack north, find safe territory, raise your families in peace." That's what Storm would have wanted. He spent the next 2 days preparing for what might be his final journey. He cleaned and oiled his weapons, then reluctantly locked them away in a wooden chest that he buried beside the cabin. A man facing trial for murder couldn't afford to be caught carrying guns, no matter how justified his actions had been. On the morning of the 3rd day, Shadow said his goodbyes to the pack. Each wolf approached in turn, touching noses with him in the ancient gesture of farewell. Lightning was last, and the young wolf's distress was obvious to everyone present. "Take care of them," Shadow whispered to Thunder. "Lead them north, to the deep woods where men can't follow. Live free, the way Storm always wanted." Thunder rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that might have been agreement or protest. Then he turned and led the pack away into the forest, not looking back. Only Lightning remained, sitting beside Shadow's horse and refusing to move despite repeated commands. "You can't come with me," Shadow said gently. "Where I'm going, they kill wolves just for existing." Lightning tilted his head and made a soft whining sound that clearly meant he didn't care about the danger. His place was with Shadow, and no amount of human law was going to change that. In the end, Shadow gave up trying to convince him. If Lightning wanted to come, if he was willing to face whatever waited in town, then who was Shadow to deny him that choice? Storm had made similar decisions throughout his life, following Shadow into danger, because that's what family did for each other. They rode down the mountain together as the morning mist burned off the valleys below. Lightning loped alongside Shadow's horse with the easy grace of his kind, occasionally disappearing into the trees to investigate interesting scents before reappearing on the trail ahead. The journey to Copper Creek took most of the day, and Shadow used the time to study the changing landscape with new eyes. Towns were growing where there had been empty wilderness just a few years before. Roads were being carved through canyons that had known only deer trails. Telegraph poles marched across the desert like an invasion of stick-thin soldiers. The territory was being transformed, and people like Shadow, people who belonged to the old ways, were becoming extinct as surely as the wolves they tried to protect. Copper Creek had grown too. New buildings lined the main street, including a proper courthouse and a jail with iron bars that looked strong enough to hold a grizzly bear. A crowd had gathered to watch Shadow's arrival. drawn by curiosity and the promise of excitement in an otherwise dull frontier town. Sheriff Hawkins met them at the jail, and Shadow could see the relief in the man's eyes when he dismounted peacefully. The crowd muttered and pointed when they saw lightning, some reaching for weapons before Hawkins waved them back. "The wolf stays outside," Hawkins said firmly. "Town's got an ordinance against wild animals." "He's not wild," Shadow replied. "He's family. Doesn't matter. Law's the law." Shadow knelt beside Lightning and placed both hands on the young wolf's head, looking into eyes that held too much intelligence for an animal. "Wait for me," he said quietly. "Stay close, but stay hidden. When this is over, we'll go home together." Lightning whined softly but backed away from the jail, melting into the shadows between buildings with the fluid grace of his kind. The crowd lost interest once the wolf was gone, drifting away to spread the news that the Apache killer had finally been brought to justice. The jail cell was 8 feet square with a single window, set too high to reach. Shadow tested the bars experimentally and found them solid, well-made, designed to hold much stronger men than him. The cot was thin and lumpy, the chamber pot was cracked, and water dripped steadily from a stain on the ceiling. It would do. That evening, Sheriff Hawkins brought Shadow a plate of beans and cornbread, along with news that would determine his fate. "Judge Crawford's coming down from Santa Fe special for your trial. Should be here by the end of the week." "And my lawyer?" Hawkins looked uncomfortable. "Territories appointed someone. Fellow named Mitchell, just passed the bar last year. He's eager to do his best for you." Shadow understood perfectly. They'd given him a green lawyer who wouldn't rock the boat, who'd go through the motions of a defense before stepping aside to let justice take its course. It was a rigged game, but at least they were being polite about it. What about witnesses? Territory's got plenty of folks willing to testify about Morrison's good character. Your side, well, that might be a problem. Most of the people who knew what Morrison was really doing aren't the type to show up in court. That night, Shadow lay on his cot and listened to the sounds of the town settling into sleep. Somewhere in the darkness, Lightning was waiting, probably curled up behind the general store or under the church steps. The young wolf would be patient, would wait as long as necessary for Shadow to return. But Shadow was beginning to doubt he ever would. The trial was scheduled for Monday morning, just 4 days away. 4 days to prepare a defense against charges that were technically true, but morally justified. 4 days to convince a territorial judge that killing Morrison had been necessary, that protecting the wolves had been right. 4 days to save his life and keep his promise to Storm. On Friday morning, Shadow received an unexpected visitor. The man who entered his cell was elderly but still vital, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His clothes marked him as a gentleman, but his weathered hands suggested he'd done his share of hard work. "Mr. Shadow? I'm Thomas Mitchell, your attorney." Shadow studied the man who would defend his life and found himself cautiously hopeful. Mitchell was older than Hawkins had suggested, with the bearing of someone who'd seen enough of the world to understand that truth came in many forms. "Sheriff says you're new to the law." Mitchell smiled. "New to practicing it, perhaps. I've been studying it for 30 years, first as a newspaper editor, then as a territorial legislator. This is my first trial as a defense attorney, but it won't be my last." They spent the morning going over the facts of the case, and Shadow found himself telling the complete truth for the first time since Storm's death. Mitchell listened without judgment, taking careful notes and asking penetrating questions that showed he understood the complexities of the situation. "The prosecution will paint Morrison as a law-abiding rancher protecting his property," Mitchell explained. "They'll say you murdered him and his men in cold blood, motivated by your hatred of white civilization. And our defense? Self-defense and defense of others. Morrison was engaged in the systematic extermination of a wolf pack that posed no real threat to his cattle. When you tried to stop him, he attempted to have you killed. Will that work?" Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. "It should. The law allows for the protection of innocent life, even animal life, in certain circumstances. But we're not just fighting the law here, Shadow. We're fighting politics, prejudice, and fear of change." That afternoon, Lightning appeared at the cell window, having somehow climbed onto the jail's roof. The young wolf pressed his nose against the bars and whined softly, his eyes bright with worry and confusion. "It's all right, boy," Shadow whispered, reaching up to touch Lightning's muzzle through the bars. "Just a few more days, then we'll go home. But Even as he said the words, Shadow wondered if he was lying. The trial would determine not just his fate, but the fate of everyone who dared to stand against the territory's vision of progress. Win or lose, nothing would ever be the same again. Monday morning couldn't come soon enough. Monday morning dawned gray and cold over Copper Creek, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like dark omens. By 8 o'clock, the courthouse was packed with spectators who traveled from as far away as Phoenix to witness what the newspapers were calling the trial of the Apache killer. Shadow could hear their voices through the jail walls, some calling for justice, others for vengeance, few seeming to understand the difference. Sheriff Hawkins brought him a clean shirt and a razor, small courtesies that spoke to the man's basic decency. Shadow shaved carefully, removing 3 months of beard to reveal the face underneath. Apache cheekbones and his father's jawline, the mixed heritage that had defined his entire life written in the angles of his features. Judge Crawford arrived last night, Hawkins said as Shadow dressed. Brought half the territorial government with him. This trial's got folks stirred up all the way to Washington. Good or bad? Depends on your point of view. Some folks see you as a symbol of the old ways fighting against progress. Others think you're exactly what this territory needs. Someone willing to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. Shadow nodded but said nothing. He never wanted to be a symbol of anything, had just wanted to live quietly with Storm and maybe find some peace. But the world had other plans for him, as it always seemed to. At 9 o'clock sharp, they led him across the street to the courthouse, his hands shackled but his head held high. The crowd pressed close, some shouting encouragement, others hurling curses and threats. Shadow ignored them all. Focused on the young wolf, he glimpsed in the shadows between buildings. Lightning was still here, still waiting, still believing his human brother would return to him. The courtroom was smaller than Shadow had expected, but packed to capacity with spectators, journalists, and territorial officials. Judge Crawford presided from a high bench, his black robes making him look like a crow perched on a fence post. He was younger than Shadow had anticipated, maybe 50, with ambitious eyes and the soft features of a man who'd never missed many meals. The prosecution table was crowded with 3 well-dressed lawyers from Santa Fe, each carrying enough law books to stock a library. At the defense table, Thomas Mitchell sat alone with a single war notebook and the kind of calm confidence that came from knowing he was right. The territory of Arizona versus Shadow, also known as John Thundercloud, also known as the Apache, the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge William Crawford presiding. Crawford banged his gavel once and fixed Shadow with a cold stare. Mr. Shadow, you stand accused of 37 counts of murder in the first degree. How do you plead? Shadow stood slowly, meeting the judge's gaze without flinching. Not guilty, Your Honor. I killed men who were trying to kill me and mine, but that's not murder. That's justice. A murmur ran through the courtroom like wind through wheat. Crawford banged his gavel again, harder this time. The defendant will restrict himself to the legal terms guilty or not guilty. The court will determine what constitutes justice in this case. Mitchell rose gracefully. Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty by reason of self-defense and defense of others. So noted. Mr. Prosecution, you may proceed with your opening statement. The lead prosecutor was a thin man named Garrett who spoke with the polished accent of someone educated back east. He painted a picture of Shadow as a savage who'd murdered innocent men out of racial hatred, a throwback to the Indian Wars who represented everything the territory was trying to leave behind. William Morrison was a pillar of this community, Garrett declared, pacing in front of the jury box. A successful rancher who employed dozens of men and contributed thousands of dollars to the territorial economy. He was engaged in the lawful protection of his property when he was brutally murdered by this defendant. Garrett went on for 20 minutes, building a case that had little to do with facts and everything to do with fear. He spoke of the threat posed by half-breed savages who refused to accept civilization, of the need for law and order in a territory still struggling to join the modern world. When Mitchell rose for his opening statement, he spoke quietly, forcing the jury to lean forward to hear his words. Gentlemen, this case is not about race or progress or the future of the territory. It's about something much simpler, the right of every living creature to defend itself against unprovoked attack. Mitchell walked to where Shadow sat and placed a hand on his shoulder. My client is guilty of only one thing, loyalty. Loyalty to a wolf who'd been his companion for 15 years. Loyalty to a pack of animals who'd never harmed a human being. Loyalty to a promise he'd made to protect the innocent. The prosecutor's first witness was a cowboy named Peters who claimed to have seen Shadow murder 3 of Morrison's men in cold blood. Under Mitchell's cross-examination, however, Peters admitted he'd been 2 miles away at the time and drunk on Morrison's whiskey. The second witness was Morrison's foreman, a man named Clark who testified about the savage attack on their camp. But Mitchell got him to admit that Morrison had been torturing a wolf pup when the shooting started, and that the innocent ranchers had been armed with enough weapons to fight a small war. One by one, the prosecution's witnesses told their stories, and one by one, Mitchell picked apart their testimony with surgical precision. By afternoon, it was clear that the prosecution's case was built on prejudice rather than evidence. But Shadow knew that might not matter. He'd seen enough frontier justice to know that facts didn't always determine verdicts. The turning point came when Mitchell called his first witness, Sheriff Hawkins himself. The lawman took the stand reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with being caught between his duty and his conscience. "Sheriff, how long have you known the defendant?" Mitchell asked. "About 3 years. He came through town occasionally for supplies." "In those 3 years, did Mr. Shadow ever cause trouble?" "No, sir. Always paid his bills, minded his own business, never gave me cause for complaint." "What about his wolf? Any problems with the animal?" Hawkins glanced at the prosecution table, then back at Mitchell. "No, sir. That wolf was better behaved than most dogs. Never saw him so much as growl at anyone." Mitchell walked to the evidence table and picked up a photograph that had been entered by the prosecution, an image of Storm's body, riddled with bullet holes. "Sheriff, in your professional opinion, does this look like an animal that was attacking humans?" The courtroom was dead silent as Hawkins studied the photograph. When he looked up, his face was grim. "No, sir. That animal was shot in the back, multiple times. Looks to me like he was running away." A collective gasp rose from the spectators. Crawford banged his gavel repeatedly, but the damage was done. The prosecution had just admitted their star victim had been murdered while fleeing. But Mitchell wasn't finished. "Sheriff, are you familiar with William Morrison's reputation in this territory?" The prosecutor leaped to his feet. "Objection. The victim's character is not on trial here." "Your Honor," Mitchell replied smoothly, "the prosecution has spent considerable time establishing Mr. Morrison's supposed good character. I should be allowed to present evidence to the contrary." Crawford hesitated, clearly torn between legal precedent and political pressure. Finally, he nodded. "I'll allow it, but keep it brief." Mitchell turned back to Hawkins. "Sheriff, what was Morrison's reputation regarding his treatment of animals and employees?" "He was known to be hard on both. Had trouble keeping cowboys because of his temper, and even known to shoot animals for sport, not just protection." "Thank you, Sheriff. No further questions." The prosecution tried to repair the damage with redirect, but Hawkins stuck to his testimony. Morrison had been a cruel man who'd made enemies throughout the territory, and his death had surprised no one who knew him personally. Mitchell's second witness was Dr. Sarah Patterson. The widow Shadow had been courting before Storm's death. She'd ridden up from Tucson specifically to testify, and her presence caused a stir in the courtroom. Frontier women were respected for their courage, and Dr. Patterson commanded attention simply by being there. "Doctor, how would you characterize your relationship with the defendant?" Mitchell asked. "We were friends," she replied clearly. "I was treating him for old wounds, and we discussed the possibility of him settling down, perhaps starting a family." "Did he ever speak to you about his wolf?" "Constantly.